Counted were the candles in the east drawing room of Ashmore Park, 47 of them, arranged in 5-tiered chandeliers, each one burning at precisely the height Lady Ellsworth preferred, and Verity Ashcroft had counted them twice that evening, because she had also replaced 11 of them before the guests arrived, trimmed the wicks of the remainder, and written the number in the household ledger, so that next month's order could be placed before anyone thought to ask. She had also rearranged the floral centerpieces on the dining table, after the head footman had placed them 3 inches too far to the right, adjusted the placement of the ivory card holders, so that Lord Fenwick would not have to lean across Mrs. Caldwell to read his own name, and quietly informed the cook that the third remove would need to be held back by 11 minutes, because Lady Ellsworth's eldest daughter had arrived late, and the table could not be completed without her. All of this had been accomplished between 7 o'clock and 1:30, in the time the other guests spent admiring one another's gowns, and at the edge of all that candlelit arrangement, standing just inside the servants' corridor doorway, with a ledger balanced on her forearm and a pencil tucked behind her ear, was Verity Ashcroft. She was 28 years old. She wore a gray dress she had worn to the last 4 such evenings because it was the dress least likely to be noticed. The guests did not notice it. They did not particularly notice her. She was the sort of woman who could move through a crowded room without disturbing a single conversation, which had once seemed like a failing and had gradually revealed itself to be a professional skill of the highest order. The Duke of Ashmore arrived at 7:45. The room altered at his entrance in the way rooms sometimes did when a person of genuine authority walked in, not with noise or announcement, but with a quiet redistribution of attention, like water finding its level after a stone has been dropped in. He was tall, dark-coated, and he wore no ornaments beyond the signet ring on his left hand. He did not look around the room in the way people looked when they wanted to be seen to have arrived. He looked around the room in the way a person looked when they were assessing what was actually in it. His gaze moved across the chandeliers, the floral arrangements, the placement of the card holders. It paused on the table, then it moved, with no particular urgency, to the doorway of the servants' corridor, where Verity was making a note about the 11 candles and the 11-minute delay. He did not smile. He did not incline his head. He simply looked at her with the measuring attention of a man who has just identified something he does not yet understand. And then Lady Ellsworth claimed his arm and drew him toward the center of the room, and the evening continued, as it had always intended to continue. Verity closed the ledger. She tucked the pencil behind her other ear and returned to the kitchen to confirm the timing of the second remove. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. The arrangement she had with the Ellsworth household was this. She received a room above the larder, £35 annually, and no title beyond household coordinator, which Lady Ellsworth had coined herself, because housekeeper would have required acknowledging that Verity did more than a housekeeper did. In exchange, Verity managed the staff of 14, maintained the accounts, negotiated with 4 regular creditors, planned every dinner and every house party, handled all correspondence that Lady Ellsworth considered beneath her, and all correspondence that Lady Ellsworth found too complicated, and kept the whole machinery of Ashmore Park running with a precision that she had never once been invited to take credit for in company. She had been doing it for 6 years. The specifics of how she had arrived at this position were simple enough, and their simplicity was the most accurate summary of how the world worked. Her father, a solicitor of modest means and considerable warmth, had died of a fever when Verity was 22, leaving behind a small house in Derbyshire, a set of law books she could not sell for enough to matter, and a cousin, Gerald Ashcroft, who held the property in trust until such time as Verity married, who had wasted no time in explaining that the house's upkeep would require someone capable of managing the associated accounts. He had meant himself. Verity had understood immediately that he meant her. She had managed those accounts for 9 months, which had taught her more about estate finances than most men learned in a decade, because necessity is a more rigorous teacher than any school. She had renegotiated 2 outstanding debts at better rates than Gerald had managed in 3 years of trying. She had caught a discrepancy in the quarterly grain accounts, £42 misattributed to a tenant who had, in fact, paid in full 3 months prior, and had corrected it before it became a legal matter. Gerald had accepted the correction without acknowledgement. He had also, 6 weeks later, introduced a business associate to the Ellsworth family, who had been looking for someone to bring order to their increasingly disordered household. The Ellsworths had offered Verity the position, with the particular confidence of people who have found something useful and do not yet understand what it is worth. She had accepted it because the alternative was Gerald's household indefinitely, and she had decided quite clearly, in the autumn of her 22nd year, that she was not going to become less than she was, simply because the world found it convenient. At Ashmore Park, she had found that her competence grew to fill whatever space she allowed it. In her first year, she reorganized the household accounts, reducing expenditure by £400 annually, through the simple discipline of tracking what had actually been spent against what had been authorized to be spent, a practice the household had apparently never attempted. In her second year, she handled a dispute between Lady Ellsworth and a wool merchant that had been quietly festering for 8 months, resolved it in one direct meeting in which she presented the original agreement alongside the supplier's actual delivery records, and settled it for £12 less than Lady Ellsworth had initially been willing to pay. In her fourth year, she managed the entire refurbishment of the East Wing, while Lady Ellsworth was in Bath, brought it in under the agreed estimate by £60, and received a brief note of thanks that Lady Ellsworth had not written herself. She had been seen, once, in any way that counted. Her father had seen her. He had had the habit of watching her work through figures at the dining table, and saying, with quiet certainty, "You have an extraordinarily good head for this, Verity. It is a great shame no one has yet built you the institution that deserves it." She had not known what to do with this observation at the time. She had written it in the margin of her account book and closed the cover over it, and it had kept her company through 6 years in a grey dress in a corridor where no one looked. The morning after the Ellsworth dinner party, she handed in her notice. She did not make a scene of it. She placed the letter on Lady Ellsworth's morning room desk, with the quarterly accounts, the list of outstanding suppliers, the staff schedule for the following 3 weeks, and a set of notes thorough enough that a reasonably competent person could manage the household for a month without difficulty. She had always believed in leaving things as they deserved to be left. She asked for no reference, because she already knew Lady Ellsworth would offer one that was accurate in every particular except the ones that mattered, and she preferred the honesty of silence to the kindness of an insufficient document. She did not know, as she walked out of Ashmore Park with her one traveling case and her account book, that the Duke of Ashmore had asked Lady Ellsworth 3 questions about her that morning, before she had come downstairs. Everard Ashmore, 6th Duke of Ashmore, had not expected to be thinking about the woman in the grey dress the following morning. He was not, as a general rule, a man who thought about things he had not planned to think about. His life operated on precisely the kind of organized rigor that kept large, complicated things from collapsing, and he had maintained this rigor through 12 years of ducal responsibilities, with a thoroughness that his solicitor called admirable and his aunt called exhausting. He spent 3 days every month on the estates at Briarhollow. He spent 2 weeks every autumn reviewing the accounts with his steward. He had, until recently, left the administrative particulars of his 2 London properties to a man named Clemens, who had been managing them since his father's time, and whose management had recently revealed itself to be not so much administration as optimistic improvisation, accompanied by creative record-keeping. It was the accounts that had made him attend the Ellsworth dinner in the first place. His solicitor, a careful man named Patrick Savage, who had been advising the Ashmore dukedom for 23 years, and had learned that the most useful thing he could do was pay attention to things other people dismissed, had mentioned 3 months ago that the Ellsworth household had been in considerable disorder until approximately 6 years prior, after which its accounts had become notable for their precision. Savage had mentioned this because Everard had asked, directly, whether there was anyone in the county who understood estate management with genuine operational rigor, rather than the performative variety practiced by most of the men Everard had interviewed. Savage had said he would make some inquiries. His inquiries had led him, in a roundabout way, to a conversation with the Ellsworth cook's former sister-in-law, who mentioned that the household ran on the quiet work of a woman named Ashcroft, who had not had a day off in 4 years, and who had once renegotiated a contract with the Derbyshire Wool Commission in a single morning that the Ellsworth steward had been failing to renegotiate for 2 years. Savage had relayed this to Everard with the specific precision of a man who understands that what he has found is unusual. Everard had arranged to attend the Ellsworth dinner. What he had not anticipated was the chandeliers. It was an absurd thing to fix on. He recognized this. But he had looked at the candles and known, with the specific certainty of someone who has spent 12 years maintaining large houses, that the arrangement was not the product of Lady Ellsworth's attention. It was too correct. It was the work of someone who had looked at a room and understood its actual mechanics rather than its social surface. Then he had looked at the table, and seen the placement of the card holders. And then he had looked at the doorway, and seen the woman with the pencil behind her ear, and the ledger on her arm, writing something down. He had asked Lady Ellsworth 3 questions the following morning. He had learned that Verity Ashcroft had managed the household accounts for 6 years, that she had received £35 annually, and that she had handed in her notice that very morning and asked for no reference. He had stood in Lady Ellsworth's morning room for a moment with this information. Then he had thanked her, declined the invitation to stay for breakfast, and told Savage to find out where Verity Ashcroft had gone. It took 4 days. She had taken the mail coach to Matlock and then, apparently, walked the rest of the way to a small village in the Western Hills where she was staying with a former schoolteacher named Mrs. Humphreys who had known her father. Everard rode the distance himself rather than sending a letter, because a letter could be declined without conversation, and he found, to his own mild surprise, that he did not wish to give her the option of declining without having first heard what he had to say. He had a wound the county knew about in outline, but not in detail, which was precisely how he preferred it. His mother, Eleanor Ashmore, had died when he was 19. She had been the person who had run Briar Hollow, not in name, because it had been his father's estate and women did not run things in name, but in every practical reality, in the specific patient-organized way that the estate had needed someone to run it, since his father was a man of enthusiasms rather than discipline. She had kept accounts that were models of clarity. She had maintained correspondence with 17 tenants. She had caught a fraudulent steward's adjustments in the 3rd year of the man's tenure, and corrected them without fanfare. She had also played the pianoforte with a kind of unhurried authority that Everard still associated with the particular quality of Sunday mornings before everything changed. After she died, Briar Hollow had taken 4 years to begin to recover. His father had managed it in the intervening period with the chaotic energy of a man who had always had someone else maintaining the actual order of things, and had not understood this until it was gone. Everard had learned, in those 4 years, the specific weight of what competent invisible labor was worth. He had learned it the way you learned things, when their absence was costing you £400 a year and the goodwill of 14 tenant families. He arrived at Mrs. Humphreys's cottage on a Tuesday morning. Verity Ashcroft opened the door herself, which meant either Mrs. Humphreys had no maid, or she had answered it before a maid could get there, and he immediately suspected the latter. She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that surprises usually mean more work. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I would like to offer you a position." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "You had better come in then." She gave him tea that Mrs. Humphreys had apparently been in the process of making, because it arrived at the table without being asked for, and she sat across from him with her hands folded and waited for him to speak. He had the sense that she had spent a great deal of her life waiting for other people to make their point, so she could assess it and respond with precision. He made his point. Briar Hollow required a manager of genuine operational capability. Clemens had been managing 2 of his secondary properties with results that his own audit, completed the previous month, had shown to include 11 unexplained discrepancies over 4 years, 3 of which suggested something more than carelessness. He needed someone who could manage the accounts, the staff, the creditors, the tenant correspondence, and the household itself, with the kind of specific organized rigor that, he said this plainly, because she seemed like a woman who preferred plainness, he had not found in any of the 12 candidates Savage had interviewed. She listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said, "What is the position's title?" "Whatever you require it to be." "Estate manager,"
she said.
"Not household coordinator. Not domestic secretary. Estate manager." Agreed. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Not surprise, not gratitude, but something assessing and careful. What is the salary? He named a figure. She was quiet for 3 seconds, which felt longer than 3 seconds. That is twice what Lady Ellsworth paid me, she said. Lady Ellsworth was not paying you what you were worth, he said. I intend to correct that. She picked up her teacup. She drank from it slowly. She set it back down on the saucer with a small, exact click. I will want to see the accounts before I agree to anything, she said. The ones Clemens kept. He had them in his coat pocket. He placed them on the table in front of her. She opened the first page and spent 4 minutes reading it with the focused stillness of someone working a problem through to its foundation. He watched her. She had the quality he had noticed in very few people, of being genuinely present in what she was doing, not performing attention but actually attending. She looked up. The third quarter of 1815. There is a figure here, attributed to general repairs, £114. Yes. What repairs? I do not know specifically. I will want to know specifically, she said. Before I can tell you what else is wrong with this document, I would need 3 days with it, and access to the property receipts. I can give you both, he said. She was quiet again. It was not the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of someone completing a calculation. You crossed 2 counties, she said. You could have sent a letter. I could have, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she said, I will come to Briar Hollow and review the accounts. If what I find there is what I expect to find, and if the terms hold, I will give you my answer then. He did not say anything. He simply nodded. She arrived at Briar Hollow 4 days later with her traveling case and her account book and a smaller notebook he would later learn she used exclusively for recording discrepancies. Mrs. Humphreys had provided her with a new pencil, which she had tucked behind her ear, before she descended from the carriage, and the housekeeper, a broad-shouldered woman named Laura Mahmood, who had managed the domestic side of Briar Hollow for 9 years, and had a talent for identifying useful people almost before they had demonstrated themselves, opened the door, looked at the pencil behind Verity's ear, and said, I'll have the east study ready for you within the hour. The light is better there. Verity said, Thank you, Mrs. Mahmood. Could you tell me where the property receipts are kept? All 14 years of them, said Mrs. Mahmood, are in the cabinet in the west corridor, that no one has opened since Mr. Clemens told us not to. Verity said, Then that is where I will begin. The opposition assembled itself with the efficient unhurriedness of English social architecture, which never moves quickly but is never idle. Within a week of Verity's arrival at Briar Hollow, the county had formed a view. It was a view composed of several elements: that the Duke of Ashmore had engaged a woman of no particular family or connection to manage his estate accounts, that this woman had previously been employed in a household management capacity of ambiguous status, that there was a Miss Cordelia Blaine of Dorset staying with the Pemfield family 3 miles east, whose father held considerable shares in the Ashmore wool contracts, and who had been understood, in the way that things in the county were always understood without being said, to be the natural and appropriate companion for a duke who had reached 36 without marrying, and who would eventually need to do so. Cordelia Blaine arrived at Briar Hollow for a Tuesday afternoon call with her mother, and presented herself in the drawing room with the composure of someone who has been told she has already won. She was beautiful in the specific credentialed way of women whose beauty has been confirmed by enough witnesses that it has become a kind of fact. She wore pale green. She found Verity in the corridor outside the east study, where Verity was carrying a stack of property receipts that came up to her chin. You must be the new housekeeper, Cordelia said, with the specific warmth of someone who has never needed to be precise about titles. Estate manager, Verity said. She did not stop walking. She set the receipts on the study table and turned back. I believe Mrs. Mahmood is showing your mother to the drawing room. His Grace should be back from the lower field within the half-hour. Cordelia looked at her with an expression that recalibrated slightly. Estate manager, she repeated. Yes, said Verity. Was there something else? There was a brief silence of the kind that occurs when a person realizes they have misjudged the weight of something. Cordelia recovered gracefully. She was accomplished at recovery, and said, with a smile that cost her nothing. I had only heard there was someone new managing things. I hope you are finding everything in order. I am finding rather a lot out of order, Verity said, which is, I believe, why I was hired. She returned to her study and closed the door. She had not been impolite. She had simply been accurate, which in her experience was occasionally more unsettling than rudeness. The door to the study was where Everard first began to understand the specific texture of what he had brought to Briarhollow. He had returned from the lower field. There was a boundary question with the eastern tenant that needed to be resolved before the autumn planting, and had found the drawing room occupied by the Blaines, which he navigated with the polite efficiency of a man who has had 12 years of practice at such things. Afterward, he had walked toward the east study, because Savage had mentioned that Verity wished to speak with him about what she had found in the receipts, and he had stopped in the corridor because he could hear her speaking inside, not to him, not to anyone, but aloud to herself, in the specific quiet voice of someone working through a problem and using the air as a sounding board. She was saying, very quietly, 14 receipts attributed to the Haverstock firm, 3 in 1813, 4 in 1814, and 7 in 1815. The Haverstock firm dissolved in June of 1812. So someone was writing receipts for a company that no longer existed, and someone was accepting them, and neither of those people was making a mistake. Everard stood outside the closed door for a long moment. Then he knocked. She opened the door immediately, which confirmed she had known he was there, and she looked at him with the expression he was beginning to recognize as her working face. Focused, present, slightly impatient to get back to the problem. I have found what I need to show you, she said. Come in. The east study table was covered with receipts arranged in careful rows, grouped by year and by supplier. There was a column of figures in Verity's handwriting along the left edge of a large sheet of paper, and beside each figure a notation in a second column, and beside that, a third column, with a question mark or a check mark, or, in 11 cases, a small written note. She walked him through it in 30 minutes with the particular directness of someone who has prepared her case and is presenting it without ornamentation. The Haverstock firm had been used to generate 14 false receipts totaling £208 over 3 years. The attributions had been split across 3 categories: property repairs, miscellaneous supplies, and staff wages. Specifically, she thought, because no single category would show an anomalous spike. The 3-way split was the kind of decision that required someone who understood the accounts well enough to know where to hide things. This was not carelessness. This was deliberate. Everard stood at the table and looked at the receipts. Clemens, he said. I cannot confirm that yet, she said. But whoever did this had access to the accounts and to the receipt books for at least 3 years. I would like 3 more days to trace the authorization signatures. Take whatever time you need, he said. She looked at him for a moment. You are not surprised, she said. I am not unsurprised, he said. I knew something was wrong. I did not know what or how much. £208 over 3 years is how much, she said. Possibly more. I have not finished. He looked at the table, then he looked at her. She had 3 pencils behind her ears, 2 behind the left, 1 behind the right, and a small smear of ink on the heel of her right hand, and she was watching him with the specific patient attention of someone waiting to see whether the person in front of them was going to do the right thing. What do you need? He said. She gave him a list. He arranged for everything on it within 24 hours. The weeks that followed were not what Verity had expected, because she had not expected to find herself looking forward, with any regularity, to the hour between 7 and 8 in the evening, when the work was done, and Everard came to the east study with 2 cups of something hot from the kitchen, and no particular agenda. He did not seem to have planned these visits. She had the sense they had accumulated without either of them deciding to allow them, like a habit formed by 2 people moving in the same direction at the same pace, until they are simply traveling together. He asked her questions that no one had asked her before, not about her opinions on the social events she attended, not about her preferences in music or her views on poetry, but about how she had learned to read a balance sheet, and what she made of the tenant situation in the eastern lower field, and whether she thought the eastern boundary could be settled by informal agreement, or would require a surveyor? She answered directly, because directness seemed to be the thing he preferred, and she found that answering directly required her to be more precise than she usually permitted herself to be with anyone, and that this precision was not uncomfortable. It was, she recognized gradually, the specific feeling of being listened to by someone who intended to make use of what they heard. She told him, one evening when the fire had burned down to orange and she had been reviewing a set of tenant correspondence, about the 42 pounds her cousin Gerald had tried to lose in the grain accounts 7 years ago. She did not make a story of it. She told it as a fact, the discrepancy, the source, the correction. He listened with the particular stillness that she had come to understand was his form of full attention. "What did your cousin say when you corrected it?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "He thanked me in the way people thank servants for work they have already profited from." A pause. "And you stayed." "For 9 more months," she said, "until the Ellsworth position." "Why did you stay?" he said. She considered this. "Because the accounts needed to be right," she said, "and because I was not going to leave something half-finished to prove a point to someone who was not going to understand the point anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say that finishing things properly was a form of self-respect," he said. "Not for the thing, for yourself." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother without being asked. Verity set down the tenant letter she had been holding. "She kept accounts," she said. "Better than anyone I have employed since." He looked at the fire. The estate was in considerably worse order after she died than it had been when she was alive. "My father did not, he had always had someone who understood the mechanics of things." He stopped. It was not the stop of a man who had run out of words. It was the stop of a man who has said as much as he intends to say on the subject for now. Verity picked up the tenant letter and said, "I found her correspondence with the Eastern tenants in the cabinet with the receipts. The handwriting is very clear. She had a system for the seasonal rental agreements that I have adapted, because it was better than what I was using." He turned from the fire and looked at her. "It is in the blue folder on the second shelf," she said, "if you wanted to see it." He said, after a moment. "Yes." His voice was level. "I think I would." She retrieved it and put it in his hands, and he stood at the study table and opened it and was quiet for a long time, reading. She returned to the tenant letter. The fire settled. Neither of them said anything else. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have learned they can be in the same room without performing. The next morning she found, on the corner of the study table, a small piece of paper with a note in his handwriting. "The eastern boundary, informal agreement is correct. I spoke with Hartley at dawn. He will sign by Friday." Below this, in the same hand, "Also, your cravat notation in the household ledger is accurate. I located the discrepancy in the hatmaker's account. Well done." She had no cravat notation in the household ledger. She turned the paper over. On the back, in smaller writing, "I mean this, generally. Well done." She pressed her hand flat on the table for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the authorization signatures. The formal confrontation arrived on a Wednesday. Sir William Ashmore, the Duke's father, retired to a secondary property in Wiltshire but still bearing the particular authority of a man who had once held the title, and believed, without malice, that this entitled him to an opinion on how it was currently being managed, arrived at Briarhollow without notice. He was a tall man, handsomely aged, and he walked into Everard's study as though he still owned it, which was a habit Everard tolerated, because the alternative was a disagreement that would consume more time than it resolved. Verity was in the East study when Sir William arrived, but she heard about it within the hour through Mrs. Mahmood, who had the specific talent of the good housekeeper for being present at important moments without being conspicuous in them. Sir William's position was this, that the engagement of a woman of no family, no title, and no social standing to manage the accounts and staff of a ducal estate was a disruption to an established order that had functioned adequately for generations. That the county had noticed, that the Blaine family had noticed, and that if Everard was not careful, the Blaine connection, which included, Mrs. Mahmood relayed this with careful neutrality, interests in the wool contracts, would cool in a way that would cost the estate meaningfully. Everard's response to this was 2 words, according to Mrs. Mahmood: which Mrs. Mahmoud declined to repeat exactly but characterized as firm. Sir William, having delivered his position and received this response, then did something that surprised Everard, which was that he asked to see the accounts. Everard brought him to the East study. Verity was standing at the table with the authorization signatures laid out in the order she had determined them, and she did not pretend she had not heard someone coming. She looked up when they entered. Sir William looked at her with the measured assessment of a man who expected to find something unsuitable and was organizing his response to it in advance. She had the receipts and the false attribution columns set out in the three-way split she had mapped, and the Haverstock signatures alongside the authorization ledger entries, and a single clean sheet on which she had written the total in plain figures, £247, which was 39 more than she had initially identified, located in a fourth category she had not examined until the previous evening. Sir William looked at the table. He looked at it for a long time. "This is the work of Clemens?" he said. "The authorization signatures are consistent with his hand across all 14 receipts," she said. "I would want a solicitor to confirm, but yes." He was quiet. He turned to look at the receipts, picking up one, then another, holding them to the light. His face was unreadable in the way of men who have spent decades not revealing their conclusions in front of subordinates. "How long did this take you to reconstruct?" he said. 8 days, she said. He set the receipt down. He looked at her with an expression that was not warmth. Warmth was not what Sir William Ashmore did, but was a kind of specific, reluctant respect. 8 days, he said. Clemens managed this account for 7 years. Yes, she said. He said nothing else about that. He looked at the table a moment longer. Then he said, to Everard, "I will see myself to the drawing room," and he left. Everard looked at Verity. She was already making a note on the clean sheet. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he came to stand beside her at the table, and he looked at the figure she had written. "He will not apologize," Everard said quietly. "I did not want an apology," she said. "I wanted him to see it." She picked up her pencil. She returned to her notes. Everard stood beside her at the table for another moment, close enough that she could hear him breathing, and then he said, very quietly, he saw it. Patrick Savage arrived at Briar Hollow on a Thursday in late October, with news that was both expected and inconvenient, which was that Clemens, having been dismissed from the secondary properties management position the previous month, had retained a solicitor and was threatening a counterclaim based on the alleged impropriety of the audit process. This was a legal maneuver with no genuine foundation, but it meant that the Haverstock evidence needed to be presented before a formal inquiry rather than handled privately. Savage was a small, careful man with the particular quality of an advisor who has learned that his most useful skill is recognizing what is already true and saying it plainly. He sat in the East study and looked at Verity's documentation and said, "This is the clearest account I have seen of a fraud of this nature. The question is, presentation." "I will present it," Verity said. Savage looked at her over his spectacles. "Before an inquiry panel." "Yes," she said. Everard said nothing. He was standing at the window. "The panel will include," Savage said carefully, "Lord Penwick's representative, given the county property interests involved, and probably Alderman Cairns from the Wool Commission. These are not men accustomed to receiving evidence from a woman." "Then they will have to become accustomed to it," Verity said. Savage looked at Everard. Everard looked at Savage. Some communication passed between them that did not require words. Savage said, "Very well." She spent 5 days preparing. She built the presentation in the way she built everything, from the specific to the general, from the documented fact to the demonstrated pattern, from the individual receipt to the total. She organized it so that the logic was visible at every step, so that a person following it could not, if they were honest, arrive at any conclusion other than the one she had arrived at. She made clean copies of the authorization signatures and the false receipt entries, and the Haverstock dissolution record, and the three-way split analysis, and the corrected accounts, total to total, showing what Briar Hollow's actual expenditure had been against what had been recorded. She also played the pianoforte in the music room every evening for those 5 days. because thinking well required the brain to rest at intervals, and she had found that an hour at the instrument did something to her that 6 years at the Ellsworth household had not entirely taken away. She had not known, until the second evening, that the piece she had been playing, a specific series of variations she had learned from a teacher in Matlock years ago, was a composition her father had loved. She did not know, until the fourth evening, that Everard was sitting outside the music room door. She knew on the fourth evening because she finished playing and sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows music, and then she heard, very quietly, the sound of someone shifting their position against the corridor wall, and she understood that he had been there for some time. She did not open the door. She began the variations again, from the beginning, and played them through with the unhurried authority she had been working toward for 20 years, and the house was very quiet around the music. The inquiry was held in the assembly room of the Ashmore estate offices, which was not a courtroom but functioned as one on occasions of formal business. 12 people sat on one side of the room: Lord Penwick's representative, a man named Callow, Alderman Cairns of the Wool Commission, 2 county solicitors, the Ellsworth family solicitor, who was present as a general observer and whose expression was one of careful neutrality, 4 local landowners, and, at the far end of the table, Miss Cordelia Blaine's father, Robert Blaine, who held the wool contract interests and whose attendance Verity had not known to expect. On the other side of the room sat Everard. Beside him sat Patrick Savage. Behind them, in the public gallery, sat Mrs. Mahmood and a woman named Charlotte Hemming, who had arrived 2 days prior and introduced herself to Verity as a friend of Savage's family, who had heard something about an interesting case and had come from Nottingham specifically to be present, which was the kind of direct, unguarded explanation that made Verity like her immediately. Clemens's solicitor made a brief opening statement that consisted largely of the word alleged deployed with the frequency and confidence of a man who believes repetition is argument. Then Verity stood and presented the documentation. She did not argue. She did not plead. She placed the first set of receipts on the table and named them: supplier, date, amount, authorization signature. She placed the Haverstock dissolution record beside them and named it: date of dissolution, June 1812, 3 months before the first receipt attributed to the Haverstock firm. She placed the authorization ledger alongside the receipts and showed that in every case, the authorization signature was consistent with the same hand. She showed the 3-way split: property repairs, miscellaneous supplies, staff wages, and explained the logic of the division, that each category remained within its expected range, precisely because the total had been distributed across 3, rather than concentrated in 1. She placed the corrected accounts on the table. Total recorded expenditure over 3 years, £7,211. Total actual verified expenditure, £6,964. Discrepancy, £247 over 26 months. She said, "I do not claim this is the complete picture. It is the picture I could reconstruct from the documents available. I recommend that a solicitor appointed by this panel review the full receipt archive for the preceding 4 years, because the method I have described requires time to develop, and I do not believe it began in 1813. The room was quiet for a long moment, of the kind that follows the landing of something heavy. Callow, Lord Penwick's representative, said, "You are saying there may be more." "I am saying the probability is high," she said. "I have documented what I can prove. I have told you where to look for the rest." Clemens's solicitor said, "This is the work of an amateur, prepared to damage a man's reputation without—" Robert Blaine said, "With the specific authority of a man who has made his money by being able to read a set of accounts accurately and does not intend to pretend otherwise. This is not the work of an amateur." He looked at the receipts. He looked at the corrected accounts. He looked at Verity with the expression of a man who has just understood something he was not expecting to understand. "This is meticulous work," Callow said. "I am inclined to agree." The inquiry panel deliberated for 40 minutes. Clemens's counterclaim was dismissed. A formal audit was recommended, beginning with the 4 preceding years. Clemens was referred to the county magistrate. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment. Then it reconfigured. not with noise or drama, but with the specific, quiet reconfiguration of a room that has had its foundation adjusted and must now settle onto its new level. Everard stood. He was across the room from her, and he crossed it directly, in front of all 12 witnesses and the gallery, and he took her hand in both of his, and said, with the complete absence of performance that was his most consistent quality, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For which part?" she said. "All of it," he said. "All 6 weeks, all 8 days, all 26 months accounted for. All of it." The room was watching them. It had understood something before it could articulate it. Robert Blaine, who had interests to protect and a daughter to consider, looked at the Duke's hands around Verity's, and at the Duke's face, and he looked at Cordelia, who was standing in the doorway of the gallery, and whose composure was, for the first time in Verity's observation of her, genuinely uncertain, and then Robert Blaine looked away, because the calculation had resolved itself without his participation, and he was a man who understood when a calculation had resolved. Everard kissed her hand in front of all of them, 12 witnesses and a gallery and a room that had just been changed by documented evidence and would not be changing back. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Patrick Savage, collecting his papers, permitted himself the smallest possible satisfied expression. Charlotte Hemming, in the gallery, said quietly but not privately to Mrs. Mahmood, "I knew it. I told Savage before we left Nottingham. I said, 'This will be the woman.'" Mrs. Mahmood said, "I knew it the moment I saw the pencil." The formal occasion of it was resolved 2 weeks later, in a drawing room at Briar Hollow, with Savage present, and Sir William and Robert Blaine, and the appropriate documents laid out in correct order. The proposal was expedient and appropriate, and fitted the requirements of the dukedom, and Everard made it in the language of those requirements, because there were rooms in which requirements had to be observed. Verity said she would need to think about it. Sir William looked at the ceiling. Robert Blaine looked at the floor. Everard said, "Of course." She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it in the specific way she thought about all decisions that carried weight. Completely, from the foundation up, testing every load-bearing point before she committed to the structure. She thought about Lady Ellsworth's morning room, and Gerald's grain accounts, and the 47 candles, and the pencil behind her ear, and the music room at Briar Hollow where she had played through the variations 4 evenings in a row, and known, on the 4th, that she was not playing only for herself. She thought about her father's voice saying, "It is a great shame no one has yet built you the institution that deserves it." She thought, perhaps the institution is not given, perhaps it is built. On the morning of the 3rd day, she went to find Everard. He was in the library, as she had expected. He was standing at the window with a letter in his hand, not reading it, looking at the east field where the boundary question had been settled and the land was preparing for winter. He heard her come in and turned, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his version of full openness, guarded in public, specific in private. She said, "I want to say yes." He was quiet. He waited. "But I want to say it for myself," she said. "Not for the drawing room, not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements your position imposes, but because you came across 2 counties to find me. You put Clemens's accounts on the table without asking me to soften what I found. You sat outside the music room door for 4 evenings, and never once told me what it meant to you to hear your mother's variations played again, because you knew I was working, and you did not want to interrupt what I was doing. And those things are the kind of things that are not calculated and cannot be performed, and I have spent 6 years in a house where the only thing I was certain of was my own accuracy, and I find that I am quite completely certain of you." He set the letter on the windowsill. He crossed the library and stood in front of her, and his hands closed over hers with the same hold as in the inquiry room, and he said, "Yes, those are the reasons. Those are precisely the reasons. I will still be estate manager," she said. "The accounts are not finished." "The accounts are never finished," he said. "I would not have it any other way." He was not going to say anything else eloquent, she understood. He was not a man who had eloquence at his disposal. He had, instead, the specific quality of complete intent, and she felt it in the pressure of his hands, and in the way he looked at her, as though the calculation he had been running since a dinner party, at a house she would never go back to, had finally returned its answer. She had been seen. Entirely and accurately seen. She was not going to step aside for anyone. They were married in the church at Briar Hollow on a Thursday in February, with Savage as witness, and Charlotte Hemming as the other witness, and Mrs. Mahmood managing the domestic arrangements with the serene efficiency of a woman who had been looking forward to this for some time. Sir William attended. He stood at the back of the church and he watched, and afterward he found Verity alone in the corridor, and he said, without warmth but without contempt, "You are a great deal more than Clemens's replacement." He paused. "I see that now." She said, "I know," and because she was Verity Ashcroft, Verity Ashmore now, which would take time to adjust to, she did not add anything to this, because it was sufficient on its own. The life they built was specific. It was built from documented fact and deliberate choice, and the particular quality of two people who understood that love was not a feeling that arrived, but a decision that was made repeatedly, in the ordinary days, in the going on. Everard read every account she completed and initialed it. This was not a formality. It was the particular way he had of showing that he had read it, that he understood it, that he was present in the work she was doing. She had not asked for this. He had begun it on his own, 3 weeks into the marriage, and it was one of the things she considered when she thought about what it meant to have been found by someone who understood how to find her. The Briar Hollow accounts, fully corrected and systematized over the 18 months that followed the inquiry, became something she had not anticipated. A model. Savage mentioned it to 2 neighboring estate solicitors. The neighboring solicitors mentioned it to their clients. Within 2 years, 3 estates in the county were using the Ashmore account structure: the 3-way verification, the quarterly reconciliation, the supplier register, and one of them had written to ask whether Miss Ashcroft, they had not heard she was now a duchess, would be willing to consult on a specific discrepancy they had found. Verity had written back and said she would, and she had spent 2 days at the Fairfield estate in March, identifying a smaller, but structurally similar fraud, and preparing the documentation for their solicitor, and she had not charged a fee, but had asked, as her only condition, that they implement the quarterly reconciliation going forward. By the end of the 3rd year she had formalized this into a written guide, 22 pages, annotated with specific examples from the Briar Hollow case and the Fairfield case, with identifying details removed, which Savage printed at his own expense and distributed to 11 estate offices across Derbyshire. It was titled, on its plain cover, in Verity's handwriting, "A Method for the Systematic Verification of Household and Estate Accounts." On the inside cover, in smaller type that Savage had added without asking her, it read, "Prepared by the Duchess of Ashmore, formerly estate manager, Briar Hollow." She had not been consulted on the formerly, but she found she did not object to it. Their daughter was born in the spring of the 4th year. They named her Eleanor, which had been Everard's mother's name, and which Verity had suggested before he had thought to suggest it, because she had seen it in the blue folder on the 2nd shelf of the East study, and had understood, without needing to be told, that it was the right name. Eleanor was, from the very beginning, a child of organized enthusiasms. She had her father's measured attention and her mother's habit of watching rooms before she walked into them, and she had, by the age of 2, figured out that the kitchen door latch could be managed with sufficient persistence, and that Mrs. Mahmood kept shortbread in the blue tin at the back of the larder shelf. On a Thursday in October, a mild one, the fields at Briar Hollow going gold, Verity was at the East study table, with the spring account books and the quarterly reconciliation spread before her, and she heard, from the corridor, the small determined footsteps of Eleanor Ashmore escaping from the nursemaid for the 3rd time that afternoon. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was writing, then she pushed back from the table. Everard was already in the corridor. He had Eleanor over his shoulder, and she was making the specific sound she made when she was half outraged and half delighted, and he was walking her back toward the nursery stairs, with the composed authority of a man who has dealt with small persons requiring management, and has discovered that the primary skill is refusing to negotiate. He passed the study doorway and glanced in, and saw Verity watching, and he looked at her with the expression she had never been able to name entirely. Not desire, not pride, not the specific warmth of a man who has been married 4 years and is no longer cautious with his own feelings. All of those things, perhaps, organized into a single steady look that asked nothing and offered everything. She looked back at him with the exact same expression. Eleanor squeaked indignantly and reached for the doorframe, and Everard redirected her and continued toward the stairs, and Verity returned to the quarterly reconciliation. The numbers were right. They were exactly right. She wrote the total in her clean round figures and drew the final line under it, and outside the window, the Briar Hollow fields held the last of the October light, and the house was warm and deliberate and managed and hers. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work.